Tuesday, 10th of March, 1818. Arrived at Highdale at 3:30 by the post-chaise from York. The schoolroom is north-facing and cold, and the inkwell is frozen at the rim. Lady Esme is shy, very pale, and did not say her own name when I gave mine. Mrs. Carmichael says her ladyship has not spoken in 3 years. I had not been told. The Duke is in town for the session. I have unpacked. Thursday, April 9th, 1818. 8 weeks of perfect silence on her ladyship's part. Today, at the third worked-out sum, 47 minus 9, in pencil on the slate, she laughed once. It was very small. Mrs. Carmichael, who happened in the doorway with the linen press list, set down the list and went out again at once and very quietly without speaking. I have ruled the next page of sums for tomorrow. Wednesday, 5th of August, 1818. The Duke is to come home on Monday week, by Mr. Pollard's word at breakfast this morning. The household is in a quiet panic. Mrs. Lowther has begun to redden the sauces. Mrs. Carmichael has had the south wing dust covers off since Tuesday. Lady Esme has set out 4 of her sums every morning instead of 2. I have ironed the white collar of my second serge gown. These were the only 3 entries in the small leather pocket diary of Miss Vivian Wycombe, 6 and 20. Governess to Lady Esme Ashwood at Highdale Park in the North Riding of Yorkshire. That referred in any way at all to the master of the house. The household had been a quiet household in his absence. The dowager had taken the south wing for her summer. The dust covers had been on the great rooms. The schoolroom hours had run from 9 to 3:30, and the small north garden from 4 to 5. Miss Wycombe had eaten her supper at 6:30 at the housekeeper's table, and had been in her own room with the door shut by 8. She was small, neat, light brown hair pinned plain, grey eyes that did not flinch, in dark serge with a clean white collar. She had been, until the November of 1816, the only daughter of the Reverend Roland Wycombe of a small Sussex parish under the Chalk Downs. Her mother, Mrs. Bridget Wycombe, had died in the spring of 1808, when Vivian had been 16. The parsonage had thereafter been kept by Vivian for her father, a quiet, learned man of moderate evangelical persuasion. He had taken a chill in the wet October of 1816, walking back from a sick parishioner, had died of pleurisy in the 2nd week of November, and had left, by reason of having spent his private income upon the parish school he had founded in 1812, no provision at all. Vivian had buried her father, packed the parsonage, and gone in the new year to teach at a small school for the daughters of clergymen at Brighton, where she had remained 14 months, and where she had been steady, patient, useful, and not particularly remarked upon. In the February of 1818, Mr. Fairfax, the Highdale family solicitor, had written in his careful, scholarly hand to the school's principal asking after a governess of plain, steady habits for a delicate child in the north. The principal had named Miss Wycombe, and Mrs. Carmichael, the housekeeper at Highdale, who had been at school with the principal in their Lewis girlhood, had endorsed the recommendation. Mr. Fairfax had hired Miss Wycombe at his Lincoln's Inn chambers on the 23rd of February at £40 a year, and the schoolroom and her keep. And Miss Wycombe had taken the post-chaise out of London on the 7th of March and had arrived at Highdale at 3:30 on the afternoon of the 10th. Highdale Park lay in the North Riding of Yorkshire, some 6 miles north of Thirsk, on the road that ran along the upper line of the moor. A pale stone house of 3 stories with a small south rose garden behind, set in 800 acres of moorland and a small home farm. The post-chaise had set her down in the gravel sweep before the south front, in a thin March wind off the moor, and the front door had opened at once upon Mr. Pollard, white-haired, plain black butler's coat, 28 years in service, who had inclined and named himself, and led her in by the side passage to the housekeeper's room, without remark, as was, she would learn, his way with every arrival at every hour. Mrs. Carmichael had risen from the deal table at her entry. Iron grey hair beneath plain linen cap, plain bombazine, keys at her hip, and had given her good afternoon plainly, and the cup of tea and the cold cut of pie left from the servants' dinner, and had then taken her up the back stairs and shown her the north wing bedchamber and the schoolroom and the small north garden through the leaded window. Mrs. Lowther had come up at 4, soft grey-brown hair beneath large linen cap, warm pale eyes, plain blue print cotton with apron, to ask after her preferences at table and to remark, mildly, that Miss Wykeham looked as though she had not eaten a proper supper between Doncaster and York. And Nurse Staley had been brought up at 4:30, plump, grey-haired, kind, plain dark grey print cotton with the child. Lady Esme Ashwood was small, white blonde, very still, in plain dark blue wool. She had not spoken in 3 years. Mrs. Carmichael had stood at the schoolroom door and had said in the same plain voice she used for the linen press, "Lady Esme, this is Miss Wykeham, who has come from Sussex to be your governess." The child had looked up. Her eyes had been a pale, clear grey blue, very steady, and had taken in the new governess from the worn boots to the plain pinned hair. Vivian had stepped forward 1 pace and had said quietly, "I am Vivian Wykeham. I am very glad to make your acquaintance, Lady Esme." She had offered her hand, palm up, at the proper governess's height for a child of 8. The child had not said her own name. She had looked at the offered hand for the space of 3 breaths, and then, with the small, grave deliberation of a person who had thought the matter through, she had laid her own small white hand into Vivian's. She had not pulled it away. Vivian had held the small hand for the count of 4 and had let it go, and Mrs. Carmichael at the door had drawn in a quiet breath that she did not then release for some seconds, and Nurse Staley behind Mrs. Carmichael had set the back of her hand against her mouth, and the first afternoon at Highdale had been, in that small way and no other, accomplished. The schoolroom was north-facing and cold of a morning, with a small marble hearth set into the inner wall and a small writing desk by the leaded window, and a square of worn Turkey carpet upon the boards, and a row of slate-blue shelves against the eastern wall, holding the schoolroom books that had served the late Duchess in her girlhood, and Lady Maud Whittaker before her. The schoolroom hours ran from 9 to 3:30, with a quarter-hour break at 11 for milk and bread, and a half-hour for dinner at 1:30 at the schoolroom table, and a quarter-hour again at 3 for a small biscuit and a slice of apple. The first 8 weeks were 8 weeks of perfect silence on Esme's part. Vivian taught by the steady, patient method she had used at Brighton with the youngest girls. Sums on the slate of a morning, the small chalk pressed into the child's hand, and the operation set out plainly, 47 minus 9, then 26 plus 18, then the long, careful trial of 73 minus 15, with the small lent 10 across the line. Reading after the milk and bread from Cowper's Task, the long, quiet country lines about the parlour fire, and the post-bag and the snail in the corner of the wall, read aloud by Vivian at the schoolroom table, while Esme followed the lines with a small, straight finger. Edgeworth's parent's assistant after dinner for the moral tale of the day read slowly the small, careful questions put to Esme at the end of each paragraph, and answered by Esme with the small, grave nod or the small, grave shake of the head. Drawing in the afternoon from 2 to 3, the small box of pencils and the schoolroom drawing book, and the slow, careful sketching of the iron poker, the milk jug, the small china dog from the mantel. Walks in the small north garden from 4 to 5, whatever the weather. Twice round the gravel paths, and once down the kitchen garden walk past the espaliered pears. Esme listened with grave, intelligent attention. She did not speak. She marked her sums neatly in pencil. She took Vivian's hand on the gravel paths, without being asked, and let it go at the schoolroom door without being asked, and the 8 weeks ran their course. On the morning of Thursday the 9th of April, at the 3rd worked-out sum, Esme laughed. It was a very small laugh, no louder than the small sound the kettle made on the schoolroom hob when the water had first come to the murmur, and it was over in less than a second. But it was a laugh, and Vivian had heard it plainly, and Mrs. Carmichael in the doorway with the linen press list had heard it plainly, and the child herself had heard herself laugh and had looked, for the first time in 3 years, with the small, startled, clear surprise of a person who had not known the small instrument of her own voice was still in tune. Vivian did not press. She did not set down the chalk. She did not look up from the slate. She marked the answer with a small tick beside the figure as she had marked every answer of the past 8 weeks, and she said, in her own steady governess's voice, "Very good, Lady Esme. Now let us try the next one." She knew, with a quiet certainty, that she did not afterwards trouble herself to examine, that the small laugh had been the small loose hinge of a door, very long shut, and that the door must be allowed to swing on its own time, and not be pulled at. That the child had been startled by her own sound, and that if Vivian had so much as turned her head, the sound would not come again for another 8 weeks, or another 8 months, or another 8 years. She wrote the second diary entry that evening at her writing desk by the north window, and she did not write of it again, and she did not speak of it with Mrs. Carmichael that night at supper or any night thereafter, though Mrs. Carmichael, on her way down the back stairs that morning with the linen press list still folded in her apron pocket, had stopped on the 3rd landing and set her hand against the wall and stood for a full minute in plain, wordless thanksgiving. May came in soft and green upon the moor, and June came after it, and July ran hot and dry along the upper line of the heather. The Dowager Duchess kept the south wing for her summer, taking her breakfast on a tray in the green dressing-room and her dinner in the great dining-room with Mrs. Carmichael at her elbow. Vivian saw her twice, once at the small midsummer dinner to which the housekeeper had been called to stand at her left hand, and once on the south terrace at the end of July, a small straight figure in lavender silk taking the late afternoon air. They did not speak. The dowager inclined her head. Vivian inclined hers. The matter was understood. In June, Esme laughed twice more, both times small, both times at the schoolroom table. Once at a small misshapen drawing of the china dog that had come out, by Esme's own pencil, with one ear longer than its body. Once at a cowper line about a hare that had taken offence at a passing wheelbarrow. Vivian marked neither laugh. She wrote of neither. She set out the next sum, the next page, the next walk in the garden, with the same plain, steady hand that had set out the first. Esme began, in the long, quiet afternoons, to draw small, careful sketches in the back of the schoolroom drawing book, the moor sheep on the upper line of the home farm wall. 4 of them in a line with their black faces turned to the south rose garden as seen from the schoolroom window at 5 o'clock, with the long shadow of the cedar across the gravel. The small china dog with one ear properly proportioned and the other set at the small comical angle that had made her laugh. Vivian praised the sketches plainly, without raptures, and Esme heard the plain praise plainly, and the careful sketches multiplied. Vivian came to know the household. Mrs. Lowther's small kindness with the extra apple tart on Saturdays at the housekeeper's table, set down beside Vivian's plate, without comment and without remark, Mr. Pollard's grave correctness with the 8 o'clock collection of the schoolroom tray, and his unfailing "Good evening, miss," at the foot of the back stairs, whatever the weather or the hour. Nurse Staley's quiet evening custom of bringing Esme down to the schoolroom for the last half-hour of the morning before 9, so that the child might find Vivian already at the writing desk with the slate set out and the kettle on the small hob. The household had taken the new governess in its plain Yorkshire way, by giving her her tea hot, her supper at the proper hour, and the small place at the housekeeper's table that had been the late governess's, and Vivian, who had not in her 8 Brighton months been given any such small place anywhere, took it without comment, and was settled. On the morning of Wednesday the 5th of August, at breakfast in the housekeeper's room at 7:30, Mr. Pollard, with a slight composed clearing of his throat between the second slice of toast and the second cup of tea, said, "His Grace returns on Monday the 17th by the noon coach from York, with Mr. Fairfax accompanying. He has written that he shall remain at Highdale through the autumn." There was a small, still pause. Mrs. Carmichael, who had been pouring her own tea, set the pot down with the small, precise care of a woman who had heard the matter clearly the first time. "On Monday the 17th, she repeated evenly. 12 days, Mr. Pollard. 12 days, Mrs. Carmichael. The south wing must come off the covers from Tuesday next, and the Great Hall from Wednesday, and the library from Thursday. Mrs. Lowther, I shall want a word with you at 9 concerning the kitchen orders." "You shall have it, Mrs. Carmichael," said Mrs. Lowther placidly, setting down her own cup. "I have been reading the sauces since last Saturday. The Duke shall have his proper soup on Monday evening, and there shall be a clear consommé, and a roast of the home farm mutton, and a fricassee of the early autumn pigeons, and there shall be a plain apple tart for her ladyship at 3:30 on Monday afternoon, with the cream stood on the cold slab." Nurse Staley, at the foot of the table, set down her tea with both hands and said, with the small, quiet voice of a woman who had carried a particular weight for a particular length of time, "His Grace coming home through the autumn. I am glad of it, Mr. Pollard. I am very glad of it." Vivian did not speak. She had, in 5 months at Highdale, formed no settled view of the Duke at all. She had seen no portrait of him. There was none in the schoolroom, none in the morning room she had been into, none in the small north passage. The great portraits in the long gallery were kept under the Holland covers with the rest of the south wing pictures. She had heard no description of him beyond Mrs. Carmichael's economical "His Grace's grave," delivered on the first afternoon by way of the only commentary she would ever offer. She had only Mr. Fairfax's London hiring letter in its plain, scholarly hand, and the £40 a year, and the schoolroom, and the small, still child at the slate, and she had, of his temperament and his expectations and his manner with a paid woman in his house, no notion whatever. She drank her tea. She set the cup down. She said in her own plain voice, "I shall wish to know, Mr. Pollard, whether His Grace will require Lady Esme to be presented to him on Monday afternoon, or whether the schoolroom hours shall run as usual." "I shall write to His Grace by tonight's post, Miss Wykeham," said Mr. Pollard gravely, "and I shall have his answer by Saturday." The south wing dust covers came off on Tuesday the 11th, and the Great Hall on Wednesday, and the library on Thursday. The long gallery pictures were uncovered on Friday, and the Holland sheets folded into the linen press by Mrs. Carmichael's own hand. Mrs. Lowther began, from the Friday, to redden her sauces in earnest, with the small dark bottle of the homemade mushroom catsup brought up from the still room, and the small jar of the anchovy paste set out on the cold slab. Esme, of her own small grey volition, set out 4 sums every morning instead of 2, in her neatest pencil, and laid the slate ready on the schoolroom table before Vivian came in at 9. Vivian took the white collar of her second serge gown to the wash-house on Friday morning, and ironed it herself at the small flat iron on the housekeeper's hearth on Friday evening, and folded it into the top drawer of the north wing chest with a small twist of dried lavender from Mrs. Lowther's still room. On the Friday at 4 o'clock, she walked with Mrs. Carmichael through the long linen press at the head of the back stairs, the small careful inspection that the housekeeper made of the schoolroom linen at every quarter, and that had fallen in the August week upon the Friday. Mrs. Carmichael, folding the small white pillowcases with the small, precise hospital corners she had learned in her own girlhood, said plainly without looking up, "His Grace will wish to know whether her ladyship has improved. I have written to him these past 5 months that she has, that she eats steadily, that she sleeps well, that she will not be parted from you at 4 for the garden. I have not written that she does not yet speak. I had not wished to give him hope." Vivian folded the next pillowcase in silence for the space of 3 folds, and then said, "You have done rightly, Mrs. Carmichael." "I had thought I had," said Mrs. Carmichael evenly. "I am not now so sure. You shall tell him on the Monday evening, Mrs. Carmichael, if you wish. Or I shall tell him at the first asking. He shall have it plainly, either way. He shall have it from me, Miss Wickham. It is the housekeeper's place." Mrs. Carmichael set the folded case upon the pile and reached for the next. "But I am obliged to you for the offer." On the Sunday evening of the 16th of August, Vivian sat at the small writing desk by the north window of her north wing bedchamber in the cold blue Yorkshire dusk. The small fire on the grate had been lit by the housemaid at 6 and had settled into the steady red bed of a Yorkshire August coal fire that would hold without further attention until 10. The candle stood in the plain brass candlestick at her left elbow. The pocket diary lay open upon the desk before her. She had not, when she had come down by the post-chaise from York on the 10th of March, with her small carpet bag and the pocket diary and the second serge gown folded at the bottom of the bag, expected to remain at Highdale beyond the spring quarter. She had expected, in her plain Sussex way, that the Duke would come home in May or June, find his daughter still silent, and dismiss the new governess on the grounds of the same lack of progress that had broken, by Mrs. Carmichael's economical accounting on the first evening, the previous 3. She had brought, against that contingency, the names of 2 further Brighton schools and 1 Lewes parsonage to which she might apply for a further post, and a small folded reference from the principal of the clergyman's daughter's school, sealed and ready for the next envelope. She had not expected the small laugh in April. She had not expected the 2 laughs in June. She had not expected the small, steady rhythm of the schoolroom hours. The slate ready on the table at 5 minutes to 9. The small white hand laid into her own on the gravel walk. The small grave sketches multiplying in the back of the drawing book. She had not expected to be writing in her pocket diary, on the evening before the Duke's coming home, of the household's quiet panic and the white collar of her second serge gown. She closed the diary. She set it on the dressing table. She put out the candle. Sunday night, the 16th of August, closed over the north wing of Highdale Park, with that particular country quiet which belongs only to great houses in the last hour before company. The single candle on Vivian Wycombe's writing desk burned steadily. She had set down her diary for the night without an entry. There had been no need. The entry of the 5th of August had said all that wanted saying, and tomorrow would say the rest, and she had no inclination to fill in the small interval between with words for which she had no use. She slept, as was her habit, with the door shut, and the window open a hand's breadth at the latch. She woke at 6 by the bell of the under-housemaid passing in the corridor with the morning hot water cans. The first of the rooks was at the great beech beyond her north window. The kitchen garden lay under a thin grey mist that had not yet lifted off the espaliered pears. She lay a half-minute looking at the panes and turning with composed governess's resolution the small thought of the day to come. By 7:30 she was dressed. The second of her 2 dark serge gowns, brushed the previous evening and laid across the chair back to keep its line, the clean white collar at the throat that she had ironed on the schoolroom hearth on the Wednesday. She set her hair plain. She drank a half-cup of tea, standing at the small north window of her bedchamber. She took up the small leather pocket diary, slid it into the deep pocket of the gown, and went down the back stair. At 8:30, she was at the schoolroom. The little girl was there before her, as had been her custom these 5 months, at the small oak table by the north window, with the slate set out and the pencil sharpened, and the 4 worked-out sums of the morning already written in her small, careful hand. "Good morning, Esme," said Vivian quietly, as she did every morning, and the child looked up and inclined a 1/4 inch in acknowledgement, as she did every morning, and Vivian set the books out for the schoolroom hour at 9. The hour ran as it had run on 5 months of weekday mornings. The little girl was calm. She did her sums. She read aloud the Cowper page they had been working through. That is, she did not read aloud, but her eye moved along the lines. And at the small turning of the page, she looked once at Vivian, and Vivian said, "Yes, Esme, the next line is the one about the snail." And Esme inclined a quarter inch and read on with her eye. By 10:15, the morning's lessons were done, and Vivian had set the slate aside and was ruling tomorrow's page. It was an odd thing, Vivian thought, sliding the rule along the line with her hand laid flat, that she had not, in 5 months, thought very much about the master of the house, and that now, with 7 hours yet between herself and his arrival, she found she still did not think very much about him. She had heard the household's account of him in scraps. She had read the brief, unornamental letters of Mr. Fairfax of London which had governed her hire. She had set her one observable question: what manner of man would mean well by such a child as Esme, at the back of her composed mind, and had let it lie there. The bell at the great hall rang at 11:30. Mrs. Carmichael had called the household together for the assembling. Vivian took Esme's small hand in her own, and they went down by the schoolroom stair to the marble of the great hall. The avenue ran a quarter mile from the South Lodge to the great door of Highdale Park, between 2 ranks of beech that had been put down by the second Duke in the year before Trafalgar. At 17 minutes past noon, the carriages turned in at the South Lodge. There were 2. The first was the Highdale travelling coach. Dark-bodied, polished, 4 bays in matched trace, the panel of the off-door bearing in painted gilt the crest of the house, a heron over a sheaf of barley. The second, drawn behind at the steady country pace, was the hired chaise from York, which had carried Mr. Fairfax up from London by the Great North Road through the Saturday and the Sunday. Mr. Pollard stood at the great door, his white head bared. The household was assembled along the marble of the inner hall. Mrs. Carmichael, 3 paces inside the door at the head of the women, the keys at her hip making no sound. Mrs. Lowther beside her with her large linen cap, freshly starched, and her hands folded over her apron. Nurse Staley a pace behind, in her plain dark grey print, the under-housemaids in a quiet line beyond, and the 2 footmen at the far end, and the kitchen maids beyond them, and at the very back. 3 paces from the schoolroom door, which gave on the inner hall, Vivian Wycombe stood with Esme's small hand, quiet in her own. The bays came up the avenue at the steady trot. The wheels crunched on the gravel of the carriage sweep. The coachman pulled up at the great door, the under-footman stepped forward and let down the step. The travelling coach door was opened. The man who came down from the step onto the gravel of his own house for the first time in the 11 months since the close of the last session was tall, dark, with the firm short jaw of his family and a single line at the brow no younger man would have. Black still at his sleeve for his late wife of 3 years. He was in a dark walnut country travelling coat over a buff waistcoat and buff breeches, brown-topped boots, a white cravat, a black silk mourning band on the left arm, and the Highdale signet on the right hand. He came up the 3 shallow stone steps to the great door without haste. Mr. Fairfax descended from the chaise behind and came up at a respectful pace and stood 3 paces off. At the door, thereon Ashwood paused once on the threshold. He looked, for one composed quarter-second, into the inner hall where his people were ranged. He inclined the smallest possible inclination, a quarter-inch only, the inclination of a man who had been master of his house since the age of 21 and had no need of larger gesture, and came in over the marble. "Welcome home, Your Grace," said Mr. Pollard, and his voice, which had read out the lessons of the household to the 2nd Duke, and to the 3rd Duke, and to the 4th Duke of Highdale, across 52 years between them, was steady. "Mr. Pollard," said the Duke, and he put out his hand once, the right hand with the signet, and Mr. Pollard, who had not been given the master's hand at any homecoming in 28 years of service, because the small composed gesture between master and butler is not given in the public hall except at a particular moment, took it once and let it go. Theron turned a half pace and inclined to Mrs. Carmichael. "Mrs. Carmichael," he said, and the deep, quiet baritone carried the length of the inner hall without raising. "I am obliged to you for the household in my absence. Your letters have done me very great service." "Your Grace," said Mrs. Carmichael, and inclined. He inclined once more to the women, and once to the men, and the household inclined back, and that was the formal welcome, and the marble of the great hall lay very still. Then he turned, with the composed deliberation of a man who has been afraid of a moment for the better part of a long carriage journey from town, towards the little girl at the back of the hall. He came up the marble in 7 measured steps. At 3 paces from his daughter he stopped. He did not stoop. He went down on one knee on the marble, a small, precise, economical movement, and rested his right hand, the hand with the signet, lightly on his other knee, and looked at the child. He did not reach for her. He said quietly, "Only her name, Esme." The little girl in the plain dark blue wool, with her hand in Vivian Wycombe's, did not speak. She did not pull back. She looked at her father with that grave, intelligent attention she gave to the Cowper poems and to the worked sums on the slate and to the small movement of a wren on the schoolroom sill. She looked at him for what Vivian afterwards counted as 11 composed seconds. She looked at the single line at his brow, and at the black silk band on his left sleeve, and at the firm, short jaw, and at the grey blue of his eyes. She did not, when those 11 seconds had passed, reach for him. But she did not flinch, and then, after a small breath drawn at the back of his throat that no one in the hall but Vivian heard, Theron Ashwood inclined to his daughter, the same precise 1/4 inch he had given Mrs. Carmichael at the door. And the little girl, with the same grave, intelligent attention with which she had looked at him, inclined back the same 1/4 inch. Nurse Daly, 3 paces behind Mrs. Carmichael in the line of women, set her hand once at the lace of her own apron and did not move it. The little girl had not inclined to a stranger since the autumn of 1815. Theron rose, slowly. He stood a moment looking down at his daughter, and the daughter looked up at her father, and neither said a word. Then he turned a half pace, and Mr. Pollard, who had come up at a measured pace behind him, said quietly, "Miss Wycombe, Lady Esme's governess, in the household since March." Theron Ashwood turned to her. He inclined deeper than he had to his housekeeper. "Miss Wycombe," he said, "Mrs. Carmichael writes that you have been kind to my daughter. I am very grateful." Vivian inclined. The grey eyes that did not flinch now. "Your Grace," she said. No more. Theron's gaze stayed on her face one further composed second, long enough that Mr. Pollard at his elbow marked it, and Mrs. Carmichael at 3 paces marked it, and Mrs. Lowther beside her did not mark it because Mrs. Lowther was looking at the little girl, and then he turned away. He retired to his apartments to wash. Mr. Pollard went up the great stair at his master's elbow. The household, at Mrs. Carmichael's quiet word, dispersed, the under-housemaids back to their work, the footmen to the dining room with the polished plate, the kitchen maids down the back stair to Mrs. Lowther's kitchen. Mr. Fairfax was taken into the morning room by the second footman with a small tray of cold meat and bread and a glass of the home ale, and the great hall, in the space of 2 composed minutes, was as quiet as the great hall had been at 11:30. Vivian took Esme's small hand and went back up the schoolroom stair. The schoolroom was as she had left it at 10:15, the slate set aside, the Cowper task lying open at the page she had ruled, the small north window with its plain calico curtain, the morning light steady on the oak table. She sat down in her chair at the table. Esme sat in the small chair opposite. Vivian picked up the book where she had set it down. She read on. Esme listened. The clock on the schoolroom mantel ticked. The afternoon ran its quiet country course. At 3, Vivian set the book down, and they had the small bread and butter that Mrs. Lowther sent up by the kitchen maid. At 3:15, they took up the book again. Esme drew on the slate with the pencil a small, careful drawing of a snail, which had been on her mind these last days, and which she would draw 5 more times that week. Vivian did not remark on the drawing. She had learned, in her 5 months, that the small, careful repetitions of the little girl were not to be remarked upon, that they were Esme's own quiet way of holding the ground on which she stood, and that the way of meeting them on a governess's part was simply to set the slate down again at the next quarter hour, as if a slate were always set down at that quarter hour, and to take up the book. At a few minutes before 5, they had come to the passage that the little girl had, in the last fortnight, taken to particularly. Vivian knew it without consulting the page. It was the passage about the snail that lives in the corner of the wall and carries its own small house with it and is, in the end, at home. Vivian read steadily. Self-collected, weatherproof, she read, and capable of pleasure on a small scale within himself. The snail draws home his horns at the small alarm, and bides the storm. He hath his shell upon his back, and goeth nowhere from it, and the dwelling that he carries is enough. Esme sat very still in the small chair opposite. She had not moved at the line about the small alarm. She had, at the 3rd minute, looked once at the schoolroom door. Vivian knew, from the 3rd minute, that the Duke of Hydale stood at the schoolroom door in the corridor. She did not falter. She did not raise her eyes. She read on at the same steady pace, as one reads to a child who has not spoken in 3 years, and who is, at the present moment, taking the small particular pleasure of the snail passage, and she did not let the man at the door alter that pace by the breadth of a syllable. He listened 10 composed minutes. Vivian marked them by the small striking of the schoolroom clock at the quarter and at the half. At the close of the passage, at the line about the dwelling that the snail carries, Vivian set the page down quietly and looked once at Esme. Esme inclined a 1/4 inch to her governess. Vivian inclined back. In the corridor, Theron Ashwood inclined once at the open door, and went. He had said no word at all. Vivian did not turn to look. She picked up the slate and set Esme another small, careful sum. In the great dining room, the Duke of Hydale dined alone that evening at the long, polished table, with a single candelabrum at his right hand, and the small, steady reflection of the silver. Mr. Pollard stood at the sideboard. Mrs. Lowther had sent up the soup and the saddle of mutton, and a small dressed turbot, and the cold cream that she had made on the Saturday. Theron ate 3 spoons of the soup, a quarter of the saddle, 2 small forkfuls of the turbot, and nothing of the cream. He read, between courses and after, 3 of the papers Mr. Fairfax had sent up with the underfootman, the Chancery extract, the schedule of the home farm, and the Whittaker letter from his sister Maud. He set down the papers at 8:45. He took a half glass of port. He rose. He went up the great stair to the south library at a few minutes past 9 and shut the door behind him. In the housekeeper's room at 6:30, Vivian had taken her usual place at the schoolroom supper table, the small square deal table at the inner end of the housekeeper's room, with the housekeeper at the head, the cook at her right, the nurse at her left, the governess at the foot, and the quiet of a Yorkshire country evening at the small fire behind. The supper was Mrs. Lowther's plain: a boiled fowl, bread, butter, a small dish of stewed plums. "He is the man he was in 15, said Mrs. Carmichael plainly, when the first plates had been set down. 3 years older, but the same man. He ate 3 spoons of the soup, said Mrs. Lowther with country directness, and a quarter of the saddle of mutton. I shall do the lighter dishes tomorrow. Her ladyship inclined to him. said Nurse Staley, and set her bread down. "She is not inclined to a stranger in 3 years." Vivian listened. She took a small spoonful of the plums. She set down her spoon. "He listened at the schoolroom door at 5, she said quietly. "For 10 minutes without speaking." The housekeeper looked at her once, gravely and inclined. The cook set down the bread she had cut. The nurse drew a small breath and did not say anything. The household marked the observation in silence, and the small fire crackled at the housekeeper's hearth, and Mrs. Carmichael said only after a moment, "He will mean well by her, Miss Wickham. Mark that." "I do mark it," said Vivian. The housekeeper inclined once, and the cook took up the bread again, and the nurse drew up her chair a small half-inch closer to the fire, and the supper went on at the steady plain, Yorkshire pace at which the schoolroom supper had gone on at the housekeeper's table for the better part of 25 years. The plates were cleared at 7:15. Vivian went up by the back stair to the north wing and sat at her writing desk with the small leather pocket diary, and did not, at the last, write anything in it. She took up the volume of Cowper from the schoolroom shelf and read in it quietly until 9:30. The knock at her door was small and known. "Miss Wickham," said Mrs. Carmichael through the panel. Vivian opened the door. The housekeeper had a small folded note on a silver salver, the seal a black wafer with the heron and barley pressed into it. "From His Grace, Miss Wickham." Vivian took the note. She broke the wafer. She read it once, by the candle on her writing desk, with the housekeeper waiting in the corridor. "Miss Wickham, I beg the favour of a quarter-hour's conversation upon the schoolroom progress at the South Library, Tuesday morning the 18th, at 11 o'clock. Mrs. Carmichael shall attend. Should the hour be inconvenient, I beg you to name another. Highdale." Vivian set the note on the writing desk. She took up her plain pen. She drew a small sheet of writing paper. She wrote, in her clear governess's hand, "Your Grace, Tuesday morning at 11 shall suit, Miss V. Wickham." She folded the sheet. She sealed it with a plain black wafer from the small box on the desk. She gave it to Mrs. Carmichael at the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Carmichael. Good night, Miss Wickham." "Good night." The door shut. Vivian stood a moment at the writing desk. She set her hand once at the white collar at her throat, and then she went to bed. She lay a quarter of an hour and considered the day, the 7 measured steps across the marble, the 11 seconds of the little girl's look, the quarter-inch of incline Esme had given her father, the 10 minutes of listening at the schoolroom door. She had no settled view of the man. She had a settled view that he had meant well by his daughter today. That, for the present, was enough. Tuesday morning. The 18th opened grey at the long north windows. Vivian was up at 6. She drank her half-cup of tea standing at the window. At 8:30 she had the schoolroom hour with Esme. At 10:30 the little girl was set on the small north sofa with her sums and her pencil, and Nurse Staley sat with her in the schoolroom, and Vivian went up by the back stair to her own room. At her dressing table she set her hair plain. The clean serge gown was on its hanger. The white collar of it had been freshly ironed on the schoolroom hearth at 9:15. She had drawn the small flat iron from the trivet herself, and pressed the collar between 2 clean linen cloths until it lay precise at the throat. She set it on. The grey eyes in the small dressing-table glass that did not flinch now. She fastened the cuff. She took up the small leather pocket diary and slid it into the deep pocket of the gown. At 3 minutes before 11, she walked the long corridor from the north wing to the great staircase, and down the great staircase to the marble of the inner hall, and along the marble to the south corridor, and down the south corridor to the south library at its end. She did not hurry. She did not slow. The composed governess's pace, which she had walked in 5 months, between the schoolroom and the housekeeper's room and the small north garden, she walked now between the north wing and the south library, and the pace did not alter by a half step. Mrs. Carmichael was at the door. Vivian inclined, Mrs. Carmichael inclined. The housekeeper opened the door. Vivian Wykeham entered the South Library. Theron Ashwood, 4th Duke of Hydale, was at the writing table by the south window. Tuesday morning, the 18th of August in the year 1818, came in clear and a little cool over the North Riding, with the mist off the beck by 10, and a steady, soft Yorkshire light upon the south face of the house. At 11:15, Mrs. Carmichael came up the stairs of the north wing with her plain work-basket and her sewing folded on the top of it, and tapped once at the schoolroom door, and said that Miss Wykeham was wanted in the South Library at the hour, and that she herself, being attendant by his Grace's quiet word, would walk down with her. Vivian set the slate down upon the deal table at Esme's elbow, smoothed the cuff of her dark serge, took up the small key of the schoolroom press in habit, and put it down again, and said to her ladyship that she should be back within the hour, and that the next sum was the 7th. Esme set her pencil neatly upon the slate, and folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Mrs. Carmichael walked half a pace behind on the corridor, and at the head of the great staircase neither woman spoke. The case clock in the great hall struck the 3/4 as they came to the door of the South Library. Dark oak shelves on 3 sides, 2 sash windows giving on to the south rose garden, a marble hearth with a low fire, a long polished walnut writing table at the centre, 2 faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn to the hearth. Theron rose at her entrance from his chair at the writing table, inclined, and asked her to sit. She sat in the smaller chair at the table's side, hands quiet in her lap. Mrs. Carmichael took the upright chair at the door, opened her work-basket, threaded her needle, and did not raise her eyes again from her sewing for the whole of what followed. "Miss Wykeham," he said, "I have been 5 days in the house, and I have not yet asked you the question I came in to ask. I beg you will give it the plainest answer you have. How does my daughter?" She drew breath once, and gave it. "Your Grace." Her ladyship reads at the level of an ordinary 8-year-old, perhaps a little above. She does her sums neatly. She draws well, sheep and roses chiefly, but she has begun in the last fortnight on a careful portrait of the marble hearth in the schoolroom. She plays the simple Mozart of the schoolroom pianoforte without faltering. She walks the small north garden at 4. She eats steadily and sleeps well. She has not, in the 5 months since I came, spoken any word. She laughed once in April, twice in June, and once at the end of July. The laughs were small. The intelligence is, in my settled view, entirely undamaged. The speech, in my equally settled view, will return when she's had a steady kind quiet at her elbow for a sufficient period and not before. He did not answer at once. The low fire put a single small sound into the hearth. Beyond the south window, the gardener was walking on the gravel, and his step was distinct and unhurried. Theron set his hand flat on the writing table once, lifted it, and laid it down again at the same place. "Miss Wykeham," he said, "the 3 governesses before you stayed at Hydale for an average of 7 weeks each, and each upon her departure wrote me by Mr. Fairfax's hand that the child's silence was constitutional and beyond correction. You have stayed 5 months and you say the contrary. Upon what is your view founded?" "Upon her ladyship's hand on mine, of an afternoon when we walk in the garden. Upon her ladyship's reaching for the Cowper task before I do at 2:30. Upon the 4 sums she has set out every morning since the 5th of August, where the schedule required only 2. Upon her ladyship's having, in the 5 months, learned to look at me when I speak to her, and to look at the door when Mrs. Carmichael comes through it, and to look at the south wall at 5 o'clock, as if she were expecting something there that has not yet come. Speech, your Grace, requires expectation. Her ladyship is now expecting." He looked at her, and through her, and past her at the south window, for the length of a long composed minute. He did not look at his hands. He did not look at the fire. He looked at the place beyond the window, where the gravel met the box hedge. "You will forgive me," he said at last, "if I ask you a thing that I cannot but feel I have small right to ask. Your Grace, you have been 5 months in this house, and I have been 5 days in it. And I have heard, this past Monday afternoon at the schoolroom door, what I had not heard in any room of any house since the autumn of 15. My daughter sitting upright and listening to a kind voice reading Cowper. I should be a poor father if I did not say to you plainly that I have observed the work you have done and that I am much obliged. Your Grace is very good. I am not. I am in this particular very late. Miss Wykeham, may I ask a favour? I should like to be present at the schoolroom for a quarter hour each weekday at 5 o'clock, as a regular thing. I shall not speak. I shall not enter. I shall stand at the door and listen as I did this past Monday afternoon. May I have your permission?" She inclined her head once and let the inclination be the half of her answer. Timon gave the other half plain. "Your Grace, I shall be glad of your presence. You will tell me, Miss Wykeham, if at any point the arrangement should appear to disturb her ladyship." "I shall, Your Grace. I am much obliged to you." He stood. She stood. He inclined. She inclined. Mrs. Carmichael at the door set the small hem of the white linen against her knee, and did not raise her eyes. The case clock in the great hall struck the 11:45, audible plainly through the south wall. Vivian turned and went out at Mrs. Carmichael's slow, careful pace, and Theron resumed his chair at the writing table and laid both palms a moment upon the polished walnut, and did not stir from it for some minutes after the door had closed. The new arrangement began the following afternoon. At 5 on Wednesday the 19th of August, Theron came up the north staircase in his quiet boots and stood at the open schoolroom door, and inclined once to Vivian at the deal table by the north window. She inclined back, and did not interrupt the line of Cowper she had reached, and the small reading continued. Esme, at her elbow with the slate set straight in front of her, knew from the first instant he was there. She did not turn her head. She sat very still, with the small fair crown of her hair bent over the slate, and her hands folded upon the deal in the way Nurse Daly had taught her at 4. At the 15:15, the case clock in the great hall struck, faint but plain, and Theron inclined once at the door, and went, and the quiet boots descended the north stair. Esme drew breath at the close of his step on the second landing, and Vivian, who had marked the small drawn breath, set the open Cowper down upon the deal and said, "Her ladyship shall do the next sum now." And Esme took up the pencil and did it. It went so on the Thursday and on the Friday. Theron at the door at 5, the 15 minutes, the single incline, the quiet descent of the stair. He did not interrupt. He did not enter. He listened with a stillness Vivian had marked from the second afternoon, as the same stillness with which he had stood 5 days earlier upon the marble of the great hall at his daughter's small hand. Esme, on the Friday, lifted her chin a 1/4 inch when his step came on the upper landing, and lowered it as he inclined at the door, and Vivian set this in the small leather pocket diary at the dressing table that night, with the brief plain word "upward." She added beneath it the words "no exclamation, no haste, the child is being given room," and laid the pencil straight on the diary's open page, and shut the diary at the close of the line. The candle was put out at the usual 10. Vivian had thought a good deal, in the 2 intervening evenings, of what the listening at the door had been for the man, as well as for the child. She had not seen Theron at the schoolroom door in the act of going. She had inclined back to his incline, and resumed the line of Cowper, and the leaving had been done without her witness. But Mrs. Carmichael had come to the schoolroom that Friday at 5:30 to fetch Esme down for her supper, and had stood in the same place an instant with a small composing of her hands she did not often make. and Vivian had read in the small composing the simple fact that the housekeeper had passed the master upon the upper landing in his coming down, and had seen what he had carried in his face. Vivian did not ask. Mrs. Carmichael did not say. The supper tray was carried down at the usual 5:45. On the Friday afternoon, the 21st of August, Vivian took her tea at the housekeeper's table at the usual 4:30, before the schoolroom hour. Mrs. Carmichael, pouring out, did not look up from the pot. He has read Cowper aloud at his own writing table after dinner these 3 evenings. Mr. Pollard mentioned it at breakfast. Has he? I had not heard him read since the spring of 15, before her late Grace was taken ill. Vivian drank her tea. Mrs. Carmichael set down the pot, took up her own cup, and the 2 women drank their tea in the kitchen quiet, and the small, steady sound of the range was the only sound in the room for the length of the small drinking. Mrs. Lowther, at the long deal at the far end of the kitchen, had set the small currant cake of the housekeeper's tea before them and had withdrawn to the larder without speaking. She had been the cook at Highdale for 19 years and knew the small careful silences in which the housekeeper preferred to take her 4 o'clock. Mrs. Carmichael at last said, in the plain tone of a woman who had been given a thing in trust she did not mean to let fall, "He has begun to read again, Miss Wykeham. It is a small thing in a great house. It is not a small thing in this house." Vivian inclined her head once. At 5:10 she set down her cup, thanked Mrs. Carmichael, and went up the back stair to the schoolroom for the hour. The second week began on the Monday following. Theron at the schoolroom door at 5 each weekday. The 15 minutes, the listening, the going. He had begun on the Monday of the second week to incline twice at the door at the close of the hour. Once to Vivian at the deal table by the north window, once to Esme at the slate at her elbow. Vivian marked the second incline at once. Esme on the Tuesday did not respond to it. Esme on the Wednesday drew breath at it and did not lift her chin. Esme on the Thursday, the 27th of August, lifted her chin a 1/4 inch and inclined her small head once in answer to her father, and her father at the door saw it. He did not exclaim. He did not move into the room. He inclined back deeper, the small grave duke's incline of the upper landings made low and plain to a child of 8 at her schoolroom slate, and went out and down the stair. Vivian wrote it that evening at the north wing dressing table. Lady Esme inclined to his grace at the close of the schoolroom hour this evening. The Duke saw it. He did not exclaim. He inclined back deeper. Sunday the 30th of August was the second Sunday after the Duke's return. The household went down to St. Margaret's at 10:30, as it had gone down on the Sunday preceding, by the South Gravel and through the small Lich Gate. The Reverend Newcombe, white-haired country clergyman, gold-rimmed spectacles, plain black cassock, was waiting at the chancel step. He preached steadily on the parable of the lost sheep, in the plain country voice of a man who had been in his parish since before Theron's mother was carried up the same gravel, and who had no occasion in any sermon of his life to be other than steady. Esme sat in the Highdale pew between her father and Vivian, with Mrs. Carmichael at the further end of the bench. At the second hymn, Esme, who had sat in the same pew for 3 years without raising her face to the chancel, lifted her face to the chancel and kept it lifted through the verse. After the service, Theron presented Vivian to the Reverend, formally on the south porch. Newcombe inclined to her in his plain country way. "Miss Wykeham, I have known her ladyship since I baptized her in the spring of 10. I am glad of any kindness done her." Vivian inclined. "Sir." Newcombe turned then to Theron, and spoke as a man might speak who had carried a small piece of news in his pocket through the whole of the morning service, and was setting it down at last in its proper place. "Your Grace, I had not seen her ladyship look up at the chancel in 3 years. She looked up this morning at the second hymn." Theron's grave mouth did not move, but his clear, cool, grey-blue eyes upon the white-haired vicar were, for the small length of an instant, the eyes of a man saying thank you in the language a duke might use to a man who had not let any of 3 years of silence make him careless of a child. Newcombe, who had read the language, inclined once more and went in at the south door of his vestry without further word. September came in cold and bright. The rooks in the elm beyond the south wall were noisy in the early afternoons. The autumn ploughing was begun on the home farm by the second day of the month, and the smell of turned earth came up to the south rose garden on the small west wind of the late afternoons. Theron, on the Wednesday and Friday of the first full week of September, walked with Vivian and Esme in the south rose garden at 5:30 after his quarter hour at the schoolroom. Mrs. Carmichael accompanied at the usual pace of 3 yards behind. They spoke quietly in the way country people speak when there is no occasion for any other speaking, of the rooks in the elm, and the late blooming roses on the south wall, and the autumn ploughing in the home farm, and the small chance of an early frost upon the dahlias by the south steps. "The west piece is to be turned tomorrow," Theron said on the Wednesday. "It was wheat the year my father came back from his last sitting, and we've given it a long rest. The bailiff thinks barley in the spring." "Barley is a kind crop," Vivian said. "My father used to say barley made its own peace with poor land." "Was your father a farming man, Miss Wykeham?" "He was a country parson, your Grace. But a parson in Sussex with 3 acres of glebe is a farming man whether he wishes it or no." "Just so." He paused at the late roses on the south wall. "These were her Grace's planting. The bailiff has kept them on without instruction. He has a steady hand for a thing once planted." Esme walked between them. She did not speak. She listened. She turned her face once to her father's voice, and once to Vivian's, and at the late roses on the south wall, she stood at her father's elbow, a small instant looking up at the small, fading reds against the pale stone, as if she had been told for the first time that they had been her mother's. She kept her small hand at her side, and did not, in the first 3 of the walks, reach for either of theirs. Sunday the 6th of September came in clear and pale blue, and with a small steady cool over the North Riding that was not yet autumn but had taken leave of August. The household went down to St. Margaret's at the usual 10:30. Newcombe preached on the small text of the cup of cold water. Esme sat upright through the sermon, with her small hands folded in the lap of her dark blue wool, and looked up at the second hymn and at the third. After the service, the household walked back through the small lych gate and the south gravel, and into the south rose garden of Highdale Park, in the clear, pale blue Yorkshire September sun. The rooks called once in the elm beyond the south wall. The gardener had been at the dahlias by the south steps an hour earlier, and the smell of the cut stems was upon the small west wind. At the iron bench by the south wall, the bench that had been the late Duchess's favourite afternoon seat, they paused. The bench had been kept clean, and the small stone flag at its foot had been swept that morning. Mrs. Carmichael had seen to it without occasion, on the principle of the last 3 years. Theron stood 1 pace from his daughter on the south side. Vivian stood 1 pace from his daughter's other side on the north side. Mrs. Carmichael stood 3 yards behind on the gravel, and had set her hands quietly together. Esme stood at the centre, between her father and her governess, looking up at the south wall where the last of the late blooming roses stood in their small fading red against the pale stone. She lifted her right hand and put it into her father's hand. Theron, who had stood in many places in his life, had not stood with his daughter's hand in his of her own motion in 3 years. He closed his fingers over the small hand and did not speak. He did not look down at her. He looked at the south wall. She lifted her left hand. She put it across the small distance between herself and Vivian, and laid it in Vivian's hand. Vivian closed her fingers slowly over it. She did not speak. She did not look down. She looked at the south wall. The 3 of them stood at the iron bench for the length of a slow Yorkshire pale blue minute. The rooks called once again in the elm beyond the south wall. The small west wind moved upon the late roses. The case clock in the great hall, audible through the south window from 20 feet off, struck the 1:30. Theron drew breath quietly. He did not say any word. He turned with the small hand still in his, and Vivian turned with the small hand still in hers, and Esme walked between them at the slow walking pace of the south gravel towards the south door, and Mrs. Carmichael, who had not stirred at 3 yards, followed at the usual 3. That evening at 9:30, Vivian sat at her north wing writing desk in the small, steady candlelight of her one-trimmed candle. The schoolroom hour was done. Her ladyship had been put to her supper at 6, and to her bed at 8 by Nurse Staley in the usual manner. Mrs. Carmichael had taken her tea at the housekeeper's table at the usual 4:30, and had not spoken of the iron bench at it. She had spoken of the dahlias by the south steps, and of the small chance of a frost, and of the linen press list for the 2nd week of September. The household had run on at its usual quiet pace. Vivian drew the small leather pocket diary from the top right drawer of the dressing desk, opened it at the new clean page, and wrote one entry in her small steady hand. Sunday, 6th September, 1818. Her ladyship took my hand at the iron bench in the South Rose Garden after the morning service. Her father had her right hand. We stood the length of half a minute and walked on. The rook called twice. I have not, in 6 months, been touched by her ladyship of her own motion before this. She has begun to be ready. She blotted the entry with the small square of grey paper kept in the diary's flap, closed the diary, set it back in the top right drawer, and put out the candle. September ran cool and bright at Highdale that year, the Yorkshire light turning a paler yellow at the leaded windows each morning. The fortnight that followed the morning service of the 6th bedded the new routine deeper into the household, with the quiet efficiency of a country house that had run by its own habit for 22 years. The weekday afternoons continued. Theron stood at the schoolroom door at 5, with the small composed regularity of a man who had taken a thing into his settled habit and meant to keep it. He did not enter. He listened. He inclined. And he went away at 1/4. Vivian, with the Cowper or the small Mozart sonata or the slate of sums set quietly in her hand, did not turn her head to mark his coming. She heard him on the corridor at 3 minutes to 5, and she did not lift her eyes. He had asked for the quarter hour as a regular thing. She had said she would be glad of it. They had each kept to their separate part of the small civil compact, with the steadiness of country people. The Wednesday and Friday garden walks continued. Vivian took Esme into the small north garden at 4 o'clock, and they walked the 3.5 slow turns of the box hedge path, while Mrs. Carmichael, with the linen press list or the kitchen list, watched from the schoolroom corridor window. On Wednesday the 9th, Esme had stopped at the iron bench by the south wall, and set her small ungloved hand on the iron arm of the bench for 2 long seconds before turning to walk on. On Friday the 11th, she had taken Vivian's hand at the box hedge turn without being offered it. These were not events to be remarked upon. Vivian did not remark upon them. She set the small, slow expansions of her ladyship's notice into the steady ledger of her settled patience, and walked on. On Wednesday afternoon, 10 minutes before the hour of 5, Mrs. Carmichael was in her doorway with the linen press list when she observed her ladyship at the writing desk lift her head and look at the schoolroom door. It was a small, slow lifting of the white blonde head, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, and Esme then returned her grave intelligent attention to her sketchbook and did not lift her head again until Theron's tread sounded on the corridor at 5 exact. Mrs. Carmichael, with the list pressed against her bombazine, marked the small expectation privately. She did not mention it. She had been 44 years in country houses, and she knew that a household must not name the small turning movements aloud before they had set themselves into their fuller shape. On Sunday the 13th, Reverend Newcombe preached at St. Margaret's on the parable of the talents. The morning was clear, and the leaded south windows of the small grey church let in long pale yellow bars across the box pews. At the third stanza of the closing hymn, Esme, in her pew between Nurse Staley and the empty cushion that had been her late mother's place, lifted her head and watched the small white surplice of the vicar at the lectern for a slow measure of the verse. Vivian sat 2 pews back at the corner of the south wall with Mrs. Carmichael, and she observed the small, slow lifting of the white-blonde head, and she did not turn her eyes towards Theron in the family pew at the front of the chancel. The closing benediction was given. The household walked back through the south rose garden in the steady country gravity that the morning had taken on, and Esme walked between her father and Vivian, and at the iron bench by the south wall she took Vivian's hand with her left hand without being offered it, and her right hand was already in her father's. That Sunday evening, after the long pale dusk had gone out of the Yorkshire sky and the household clocks had struck the hour of 10, Theron came down to the South Library for a book. He had thought to find the room dark. He found the single-trimmed lamp on the writing table by the south wall, and Vivian at the small standing shelf by the chimney-piece, with the second volume of Cowper in her hands. She had come down by the back stair from the north wing. She inclined. He inclined. They stood 3 feet apart at the bookshelves. The chimney was warm, and the small fire was banked for the night. Theron set his hand on the back of the writing-chair. He said in the steady, deep baritone that he had wished for some weeks now to put a small, plain question to Miss Wykeham, and that he had not until now had a quiet moment in which to put it. Vivian inclined. He asked her whether she was content at Highdale. He asked her whether she would be content to remain at her present terms through the spring quarter and beyond. He asked her whether the sum of £40 a year was sufficient to her settled satisfaction. Vivian set the Cowper volume on the small standing shelf. She said in the clear, quiet voice that did not flinch that she was content. She said that she would be glad to remain. She said that the terms suited her. Theron inclined. Vivian inclined. They parted at the South Library door, he going out to the corridor by the east passage, and she by the back stair to the north wing, and neither of them spoke of the small conversation again to any other person at Highdale. Thursday the 17th opened with a thin clear mist along the beck and burned away by 9. The schoolroom hours ran their usual course from 9 to 3:30. At 4:15, Vivian set down the small slate of the afternoon's sums and took up the Cowper that lay on the corner of the writing desk by the leaded window. Esme was at her own writing desk with the sketchbook and the lead pencil, drawing the small, slow, careful shape of a snail shell she had observed on the box hedge in the garden the afternoon before. Vivian sat in the small reading chair. She opened the Cowper at Book 1 of the task. Mrs. Carmichael was in the schoolroom door corridor, with the small mending basket and the white linen napkin she had set herself to hem for the housekeeper's table. The Yorkshire afternoon sun came in at the leaded window in long, pale yellow bars. Vivian read aloud, in the steady, quiet voice of the country governess, the passage in which Cowper observed the small creature at its slow domestic work, the snail that lived in the corner of the wall, that drew itself into its quiet shell at evening, that did not stir until the early hour at which the household first walked out into the garden. The lines moved with the small, even rhythm of country observation. The Yorkshire afternoon held very still at the leaded window. At the line that touched the small inward shape of the snail returning to its quiet shell, the line that named the small, steady coming home of the creature to the place that knew it. Esme set down her lead pencil. She rested it across the open page of the sketchbook. She lifted her head and looked at Vivian across the schoolroom rug. She said in a small, clear voice that had not been heard at Highdale Park in 3 years and 4 months, "Papa." She said it once. She did not say it twice. She returned her grave, intelligent attention to the open page of the sketchbook. She picked up her lead pencil. She continued the slow, careful shape of the snail shell on the corner of the page. Vivian did not exclaim. She did not draw a breath that might have been heard. She set the cowper down upon the seat of the small reading chair beside her. She said, in the steady country voice she had used at the schoolroom for the 25 weekday afternoons of the autumn, "Yes, your papa shall come at 5, as he always does." Esme did not lift her head. She continued the small, slow line of the snail shell. The Yorkshire afternoon held very still. Mrs. Carmichael, at the schoolroom door corridor with the white linen napkin half hemmed in her lap, did not lift her eyes from the work. The needle did not slow in her fingers. She set the next stitch in the steady country tempo of the 44 years she had given to the great houses of the north. But she had heard. She finished the small length of hem she had set herself. She knotted the thread. She set the napkin into the mending basket. She rose from the corridor chair without sound and walked the south corridor at her ordinary pace, neither slow nor quick, and at the south library she inclined at the open door. Theron sat at the writing table by the south wall with the autumn estate account spread before him and the standing letters from his Yorkshire steward set in a small neat pile at his right hand. He looked up at her in the doorway. She said in the quiet housekeeper's voice that gave nothing away to the corridor beyond, "Your Grace, her ladyship has spoken." Theron set down his pen. He did not ask what she had said. He rose from the writing chair. He inclined to Mrs. Carmichael at the doorway. He walked the corridor in his ordinary measured pace, and at the schoolroom door he came to a stand at 3 minutes before 5, earlier than his accustomed quarter hour. And he held himself at the doorway as he had held himself at the doorway these 25 weekday afternoons of the autumn. Esme, at her writing desk by the leaded window, set down her lead pencil. She lifted her head. She looked at her father across the schoolroom rug. She said, "Papa." Theron did not weep. He did not draw a breath that might have been heard. He crossed the schoolroom rug in 3 steady strides. He knelt on one knee at her writing chair. He took her small hand in his own. He said, in the deep, quiet baritone that did not break, "I have heard you, Esme." Vivian, with the cowper laid aside on the seat of the small reading chair, had risen at Theron's small, unspoken gesture and had stepped out into the corridor. She walked 10 paces along the corridor and set her hand on the leaded sill of the south window. Mrs. Carmichael stood at the schoolroom door at 3 paces distance from the writing desk and from the small kneeling figure of the father at his daughter's chair. The Yorkshire September afternoon sun came in at the leaded window in long pale yellow bars across the corridor boards. Vivian heard, very faint, from the schoolroom, Esme for the 3rd time in 3 years and 4 months, saying the small clear word, "Papa." Vivian did not turn her head. She did not weep. She set her hand on the leaded sill. And she stood very still, and the Yorkshire afternoon stood very still about her, and the small inward thing that the silence had been keeping at bay at Highdale for 3 years and 4 months had come home in its proper time to its quiet shell. Word reached the household within the hour by the slow, steady country tempo of Mrs. Carmichael's quiet rounds. She went first to the still room with a word for Mrs. Lowther, who was at the kitchen window scoring the apple skins for the evening tart. Mrs. Lowther set down the small paring knife. She set down the wooden spoon. She did not speak. She rested her hand on the rim of the great mixing bowl and looked out at the small flagged kitchen garden for the slow measure of half a minute. And then she took up the paring knife again and went on with the apple skins in the steady country tempo of the 34 years she had stood at that window. Mrs. Carmichael went on to the linen press at the north corridor, where Nurse Staley was at the long oak chest with the folded white linen of the schoolroom napkins set out in 3 neat piles. The housekeeper inclined. She gave the word. Nurse Staley set down the napkin she held. She sat down on the long oak chest, with both her hands set very still upon her lap. She did not speak. She did not weep. She sat in the steady quiet of the 49 years she had given to country houses, and to the small white blonde child she had nursed in her arms in the first hour of her life, and she let the news settle into its proper place. Mrs. Carmichael went last to the dining room, where Mr. Pollard was at the sideboard polishing the small silver salt cellars with the white linen polishing cloth at his quiet evening round. The housekeeper inclined. She gave the word. Mr. Pollard set the salt cellar he held back into its place. He set the linen polishing cloth into the small basket at the side of the sideboard. He inclined his head, the rare small inclination he reserved for the very greatest of moments, and he walked once round the long mahogany table of the dining room and set each of the 8 plates a 1/4 inch straighter at its place. He did not speak. He returned to the sideboard and took up the small silver salt cellar again, and the steady country tempo of the great house at evening folded the news quietly into its hour. Friday the 18th, Esme at the schoolroom door at 5, said Papa once. Theron crossed the rug. He knelt on one knee. He took her small hand. He inclined. Saturday the 19th. At the morning slate of sums, Esme set down her lead pencil at the 4th worked-out sum and said, looking at Vivian across the schoolroom rug, the 2nd word of her autumn, Miss. Vivian inclined. She said quietly that Miss Wykeham was very glad. She set the slate down. She did not exclaim. Saturday evening, Esme came down to the housekeeper's table for the first time, with Vivian at her side and Nurse Staley behind her. She sat in the small oak chair at the foot of the table opposite Mrs. Lowther. At the cutting of the loaf, Esme set her small hand on the white linen cloth at her place, and she said, looking at Mrs. Lowther, "Bread." Mrs. Lowther set a small slice of the warm wheaten loaf on her plate. She did not speak. She inclined. Sunday the 20th. At the morning service at St. Margaret's, Esme spoke no word. At the south porch after the service, while Vivian and Nurse Staley were at the iron gate with Mrs. Carmichael, Theron drew the Reverend Newcombe aside to the small grey corner of the porch and told him in 2 plain sentences what had happened in the schoolroom on Thursday afternoon. The Reverend Newcombe inclined his white head once. He said in the quiet, country voice of the 58 years he had given to the parish, "I had thought it might be the snail." He inclined again. He went back to his vestry. Tuesday the 22nd opened with a thin, clear sun at the leaded windows of the South Library, and the autumn estate accounts laid open at the writing table for the 2nd time that week. At noon, the great gates of the avenue gave admission to a hired post-chaise that had come up from the York Road by the 8 o'clock change of horses at Beckwith. Mr. Pollard stood at the great door of Highdale Park as the chaise drew up upon the gravel. He did not incline. He waited. The visitor descended. He was florid, oily, and a primrose waistcoat showed below the unbuttoned greatcoat at the breast, and a quizzing glass on a black ribbon hung at his lapel. He gave his name, Sir Ronald Castlereagh of Castlereagh Hall in Buckinghamshire, 3rd cousin once removed of the late Lady Lynette Ashwood through the Castlereagh connection on the late Duchess's mother's side. He had come from London, he said, with a solicitor's letter upon a family matter that would not keep. Mr. Pollard inclined the 1/8 of an inch that he reserved for unwelcome cousins. He took the card. He took the letter. He showed Sir Ronald into the morning room and went the south corridor at his measured tempo to the South Library. Mr. Fairfax, who had come down from London on Friday afternoon for the Michaelmas accounts and was still at Highdale, sat at the small writing table by the south window of the library, thin, grey, Scholarly, with gold-rimmed spectacles and the plain black superfine of a London solicitor of the better sort. Theron rose from the writing chair at the great table. Mr. Pollard gave the card and the letter. Theron set them upon the writing blotter and read the letter through once, at the steady pace at which he read all letters, and then he inclined to Mr. Fairfax and asked the solicitor to attend him in the morning room. In the morning room, Sir Ronald stood upon the worn Turkey rug before the chimney-piece with the quizzing glass set to his eye. Theron inclined 1/4 of an inch. Mr. Fairfax inclined and took the small writing table at the south window of the morning room, with a sheet of writing paper drawn before him and his pen taken up. Sir Ronald began. His voice was the oily voice of a London club at 4 in the afternoon. Your Grace, the Castlereagh cousins have for some time been disturbed by the report, confirmed to us by certain quarters in the county and lately by a London friend of the late Duchess's family, that her ladyship Lady Esme has continued in a state of speechlessness now of 3 years, and that this state must by any reasonable measure be considered the consequence of neglect, or at the very least, of an arrangement of the household such as is unsuited to the needs of a child of her birth. I have come, in family duty, to lay before you a petition that joint guardianship of her ladyship be entered, with the Castlereagh cousins as co-trustees, in the Court of Chancery, to ensure that her ladyship's future shall not be jeopardized by, forgive me, a continuing neglect. Theron stood at the chimney-piece in the steady cold composure that he had brought down through the south corridor with him. He did not interrupt. He waited until Sir Ronald had finished and had set the quizzing glass down upon the black ribbon at his lapel. He answered in the deep, quiet baritone, in the 4-sentence form by which his father and grandfather had answered all unwelcome cousins at Highdale Park for the 80 years of the great house's quiet country authority. Sir Ronald. Lady Esme spoke for the first time in 3 years on the afternoon of Thursday the 17th of September. She has, in the 4 days since, spoken 5 further words. The petition you propose has no basis in fact, and your London solicitor shall find no court of chancery willing to entertain it. Mr. Pollard, his lordship is leaving us. Mr. Pollard inclined at the door of the morning room. Sir Ronald, with the oily half-smile gone from his florid face, blustered. He said the family had a duty. He said the report had been confirmed. He said the petition would be filed by Hilary term. Mr. Fairfax set down his pen at the small writing table. He rose. He inclined to Theron and went out by the south corridor to give the order to the under-coachman at the great door for Sir Ronald's chaise. Sir Ronald took up his hat from the small side table at the chimney. He set the quizzing glass at his eye and let it fall again. He inclined the small clipped half-inch of a man who had lost the room and would not have it back. Mr. Pollard showed him out. The chaise drove down the avenue at 12 minutes past 1. That afternoon at the schoolroom door at 5 o'clock, Theron stood as he had stood these 25 weekday afternoons of the autumn. Esme at her writing desk by the leaded window set down her lead pencil. She lifted her head. She looked at her father across the schoolroom rug. She said, "Today," 2 words instead of 1. "Papa, come." It was by the household's silent reckoning her 10th word of the autumn. Theron crossed the schoolroom rug. He did not kneel. He took the small reading chair beside her writing desk and sat. He took up the cowper that lay still on the corner of the desk. He opened it at book 1. He found the passage Vivian had read 4 afternoons before. Vivian, 3 paces back at the schoolroom door, did not move. Mrs. Carmichael, with the linen press list in her hand, did not lift her eyes from the corridor floor. Theron read aloud the small, even passage about the snail in the corner of the wall, and the slow domestic coming home to the quiet shell, in the deep quiet baritone of a man who had not, in 35 years of his life, read a small homely country verse aloud to any creature at all. He read it through to the end. He did not look up at the leaded window when he had done. He set the book down upon the writing desk beside the sketchbook. He inclined to his daughter. Esme inclined to her father. The Yorkshire September afternoon sun came in at the leaded window in long pale yellow bars. On Wednesday morning, the 23rd of September, Mr. Fairfax departed Highdale Park for London by the 8 o'clock post-chaise. He carried in his thin leather case the full record of the Castlereagh application as Sir Ronald had left it on the morning-room table, the family solicitor's letter, the bare assertion of joint guardianship, the small heap of references to extended silence and manifest neglect, which any country magistrate would have read once and set aside, and, in a separate sealed pouch, the certified record of the late Duchess's settled estate, as it stood at her death in October 15, with the names of every Castlereagh cousin and the precise share of Esme's portion as Highdale's grandfather had charged it. Mr. Fairfax had, before he left, sat for an hour at the South Library with Theron at the writing-table. He had said plainly that the Castlereagh case had no standing in equity. He had added, as plainly, that the standing of a case in equity was not what made a man like Sir Ronald hold his tongue in London. Theron, in his quiet voice, had agreed. They had set the matter on a formal footing. Mr. Fairfax would lodge the answer at Lincoln's Inn on the Friday. He would call upon the Castlereagh family solicitor on the Saturday. He would, by separate quiet inquiry, ascertain in the week following what credit Sir Ronald possessed at his clubs and what debt stood against him at the gaming tables. By the close of business on the Friday, Mr. Fairfax had filed. By the close of business on the Saturday, the Castlereagh family solicitor had received him with the wary courtesy of a man whose client had instructed him without instructing him entirely. Sir Ronald, in the meantime, had begun to tell the story. He told it first at White's on the Saturday evening, in the smaller card-room near the fire, where the men who did not play after midnight were sitting with their port. And he told it again on the Sunday at Boodle's, and again on the Monday after a long dinner where the wine had gone round 9 times. The story he told was not the story Mr. Fairfax had filed. The story he told had a silent child neglected in a North Yorkshire schoolroom by a widowed duke too proud to send her south, a governess of doubtful origin set over her by a housekeeper without consultation, a Castlereagh cousin barred at the door of the morning-room with no civil hearing. The story moved as such stories move in a London where the season had not yet properly opened, and where every drawing-room was hungry for an autumn matter. By the Thursday, it had reached 3 drawing-rooms in Mayfair. By the Saturday, it had reached 6. Within 5 days of Sir Ronald's first telling, Lady Maud Whittaker's name was in it, for Lady Maud was the Duke's only sister, and the natural party to be consulted upon a matter of his daughter, and any London hostess hearing the story for the 3rd time would put the name to it within the hour. It was Lady Sefton, dining quietly with the Spencers on the Friday evening, who first put Maud's name to the matter aloud, and it was Sefton's husband, hearing his wife at the table, who set a small note down to Whittaker Hall the following morning at his own hand. On the Friday the 2nd of October, at 3:30 in the afternoon, the Whittaker travelling coach turned in at the great avenue of Highdale Park. It came at a steady country pace from Whittaker Hall in the West Riding, the 4 bay horses, well matched, the coachman in plain dark livery, 2 trunks strapped at the back and a small valise inside upon the opposite seat. It drew up at the south front at 25 minutes before 4. Mr. Pollard had the great door open. The under-footman was at the lower step. Lady Maud Whittaker descended first, dark hair like her brother's, plain country dress, kind hazel eyes, and laid her gloved hand for one steady moment on Mr. Pollard's sleeve in the country greeting of a woman who had known him since she was 9 years old. Sir Conrad Whittaker came down after her, stout, country kind, soft brown hair, and inclined to Pollard with the small, quiet civility of a man who had married into a great house and had never once forgotten which house he had married into. Theron stood at the inner door of the great hall. He inclined to his sister. She crossed to him at the country pace of the country wife she had become, and laid her hand upon his sleeve as she had laid it upon Pollard's, and said only his name, once, in the plain Yorkshire-warmed voice she had carried since her marriage at 22. Conrad came up behind her and put out his big country hand. Theron took it. Esme was not at the great hall. Vivian, by Theron's earlier word and her own quiet instruction at 2:30, had kept the schoolroom hour running. The slate was at 3:30 sums. The small cowper was open at the marker. The north window stood half a finger breadth, lifted for the air. Theron had said to his sister at the inner door, before Conrad had quite come up the steps, that Esme should be brought down by Miss Wykeham at 5, in her own time, when the schoolroom hour ended. That Maud and Conrad had not seen the child in 4 months. That the meeting should be at the morning room, not at the great door, and not crowded. Maud had inclined once. Tea was set in the morning room at 4, Mrs. Carmichael at the side table, the small fire drawn up, the rain only threatening at the south windows, and not yet falling. Maud took the chair by the fire, Conrad the chair opposite, Theron the chair at the chimney-piece, where he had sat in every conversation of consequence he had held in that room since the death of his father. The conversation ran 40 minutes. Maud, after the first quiet quarter hour of country news and the West Riding harvest and Conrad's stewardship of his own father's estate, set her cup down and looked at her brother. "Theron, Sir Ronald has been at White's these 10 days past. Conrad heard it from Sefton at Boodle's on Tuesday. I shall go up to town in the week of the 14th and set it straight in 3 drawing-rooms. The Castlereagh matter is empty." Conrad, in his quieter country voice, set his own cup down. "It is empty. Fairfax has the case in hand. The Chancery threat will collapse within the fortnight." Theron nodded once. Maud held her composed silence for a small minute, and then she said, without looking away from him, "And the governess." Theron set his cup upon the small table at his elbow. He answered plainly, in the plain voice he had used to his sister all his life. "Miss Wykeham is the reason my daughter has spoken 25 words in the past 3 weeks. The household is built around her steadiness now. The household intends to keep her." Maud did not press. She looked once at Conrad, and Conrad inclined the slow, steady incline of a country husband who had heard his wife's mind and had no quarrel with it. And then Maud reached for her cup again, and the conversation moved on to the question of the small east meadow at Whittaker that Conrad was minded to drain in the spring. At 5 o'clock, the small clock on the morning-room mantel struck. Vivian brought Esme down by the back stair and the matted corridor that ran behind the green baize door. The child had been told at the close of the schoolroom hour, in 3 plain sentences, that her aunt and uncle had come from Whittaker Hall, and that they were waiting in the morning-room, and that her papa was with them. Esme had heard. She had set her slate pencil in its groove. She had washed her hands at the small basin in the schoolroom corner. She had let Vivian smooth the collar of her plain, dark blue wool. She entered the morning-room 3 paces in front of Vivian. Maud rose from the chair by the fire. Conrad rose with her. Theron did not rise from his chair at the chimney-piece, by the small, steady habit of the parent who knew that a too formal greeting at such a moment would set the child's silence at the door. Esme stopped at the worn Turkey rug. She inclined to her aunt, the 1/4-inch incline she had given strangers in the September of 15, before the long silence had closed over her. And then she did what no one in the room had expected. She crossed the rug at the slow, steady country child's pace and stood at Maud's knee. She looked up. She said, in her small, clear, 3-month out of 3 years voice, "Aunt Maud." Maud did not weep at the table. She did what she had not done in any drawing room since she had married Conrad 16 years before. She covered her hazel-eyed face with her hand for one composed minute. Conrad laid his big country hand on his wife's shoulder and held it there. Theron did not move from his chair at the chimney-piece. Vivian, at the door 3 paces behind the child, inclined once at her own steadiness, and held her place, and did not step forward. When Maud put her hand down, she set both her hands on Esme's small shoulders and looked at her, and said only, "Esme, I am very glad to see thee." The thee was the West Riding country usage Maud had taken from her husband's people and used in her own house with her own children. She had not used it at Highdale in 9 years. Esme inclined. Maud kissed her once upon the forehead. The child returned to Vivian at the door, and Vivian took her back to the schoolroom by the same matted corridor, and the morning room was quiet for 1 minute after the door closed, and then Conrad said, in his quiet country voice, "Well then," and the matter was understood between the 3 of them without further word. Maud and Conrad stayed at Highdale until Sunday afternoon. Maud took the long measure of Vivian at 3 afternoon teas in the morning room, at 2 morning room conversations of half an hour each upon the Saturday and the Sunday before church, and at Saturday evening's dinner in the small family dining room with Conrad and Theron at the table, and the candles trimmed and the second course set out by 7:30. Maud asked Vivian plain questions in her plain voice. Vivian answered plainly. Maud watched the small things, how Vivian set her napkin, how she answered Conrad's small country jokes without forcing herself to laugh, how she spoke of Esme without speaking of Esme too much, how she did not, in any of the 7 hours of conversation Maud had with her at the Highdale table, once mention her own circumstances, or the salary at which she was hired, or the question of her future at the house. After the morning service at St. Margaret's on the Sunday, the household walked back through the South Rose Garden, as had become their settled habit since the September Sunday when Esme had first taken Vivian's hand at the iron bench. Maud fell back at the second turning. She took her brother's arm at the small mossed sundial, and held him a quarter pace behind Conrad and Vivian and Esme, who had gone on toward the iron bench. Theron. She did not look at him. She looked at the box hedge. She is the steadiest woman I have ever met at a Yorkshire country house. She has saved your daughter, and she has not, in the saving, asked you for one thing. I shall set the London matter straight. I shall not speak of any further matter to you upon her account. That is your concern and her concern, and not the concern of any other person living. But I shall observe that she is a treasure. I shall now go in to tea." Theron inclined. They walked on. The Whittaker travelling coach went down the avenue at 2:30 on the Sunday afternoon. Maud kissed Esme on the schoolroom doorstep. Conrad shook Theron's hand at the great door. The coach was gone by 3. Maud went up to town on the Tuesday of the following week. Whittaker House in Hill Street was opened for her at her own quiet word 3 days in advance. Her maid travelled down with her trunks on the Monday. Sir Conrad remained at Whittaker Hall for the West Riding business of the autumn. Her letters back to Theron came on the Wednesdays. The first, written from Hill Street on Wednesday the 14th of October, ran in plain warm hand. "My dear Theron, I have called these 3 days past on Lady Sefton, on the Duchess of Devonshire, and on Lady Spencer. I have laid the matter of Esme's speech return before each of them in 3 plain sentences. The date of the first word, which was the 17th of September, the word, which was Papa, and the count of words she has spoken since, which by Conrad's report of Sunday last stood at 25. I have named Miss Wykeham by her name in every drawing-room. I have been received warmly in all 3. I shall write again on Wednesday. Maud. The 2nd of Wednesday the 21st of October. My dear Theron, I dined at Devonshire House on Monday. Sir Ronald was not in town that evening. He had been at Newmarket on the Saturday and had gone down to his place in Berkshire on the Monday morning. The story has been heard in 3 further drawing rooms in the week past, and in every one of them it has been heard now, with the addition of Esme's first word and the date of her first word and Miss Wycomb's name. By Tuesday next, Sir Ronald shall not be admitted at White's. Mard. The 3rd of Wednesday the 28th of October. My dear Theron, it is done. Sir Ronald was refused at the door of White's on the Tuesday evening by the porter, who had his instruction from the committee, who had had the matter laid before them on the Monday by Sefton himself. Sefton's husband had, the week before, called quietly upon the Castlereagh family lawyer. The petition shall not now be filed. The lawyer would not have filed it in any case, but the matter is now closed upon both sides. I come down to Whittaker on the Saturday. I shall come over to Highdale on the Tuesday, following with Conrad for the day. Maud. Theron set the 3rd letter into the small locked drawer of the South Library writing table on the Friday evening, with the first 2 letters, and with Mr. Fairfax's separate report. For Mr. Fairfax had not been idle. By Tuesday the 13th of October, that is, the day before Maud went up to town, Mr. Fairfax had completed the separate quiet inquiry he had set in hand on the Saturday in London. He had found Sir Ronald's gambling debts to stand at £3,800, of which the larger part was at hazard at Watier's and at Faro, at a private house in Albemarle Street, and the remainder in tradesmen's accounts of the kind a man of 47 could no longer pay without writing to his lawyer. Mr. Fairfax had ascertained, by careful canvass of the 4 solicitors in Lincoln's Inn, who might in any circumstance have filed the Chancery bill that Sir Ronald's family lawyer had drafted, that not one of them would file the bill upon credit. The Chancery threat had collapsed for want of any willing hand. Mr. Fairfax wrote so, in 3 short sentences, on the Tuesday evening. Theron had the letter by the Friday morning. Through October and into November, the schoolroom hour ran as it had run since the 17th of September. Esme's words multiplied slowly. By the close of October, she spoke 15 words a day at the schoolroom, and at supper at her father's table, and at the small north garden in the late hour after sums. By the middle of November, the count stood at 40. By the last week of November, she was reading aloud, hesitantly, with the small pauses of a child who had not used her voice for 3 years and had only now begun to find it. The small Cowper passages Vivian had read to her these 8 months past, beginning with the snail in the corner of the wall and going on, in the small, steady way she had with every accomplishment she set her hand to the longer pieces of the task that Vivian had marked in the margin in pencil. Theron sat in the small reading chair beside her at 5 every weekday afternoon. He did not interrupt her. He did not correct her pronunciation when she set the stress wrong upon a word she had not heard spoken in 3 years. He listened. When she came to the end of a passage, he said only, "Thank you, Esme." And she inclined to him, and he kissed the top of her white blonde head and went down to the South Library for the half-hour before dinner. The other words came in their own slow order through those weeks. Bread, please, miss, and once, on the 2nd Sunday of November, as she stood at the schoolroom mantel, looking up at the small oval miniature of the late Duchess that had been set there in the autumn of 15, the word "Mamma," said once in her small clear voice and not repeated, with Vivian at the writing desk 3 paces behind her, and Theron not in the room. Vivian stood at the leaded window in the corridor outside the schoolroom in those quarter hours, with her small pocket diary closed in her hand, and looked out at the south lawn and the rose garden and the dark line of the beech avenue against the November sky. She did not write in the diary. She had not written in it since the 17th of September. She held it. She had been at Highdale 8 months and 2 weeks. She had been hired by Mr. Fairfax in London on Mrs. Carmichael's recommendation. She had been paid £40 a year, and her board and the small north room, and she had not, in that long autumn, allowed herself to set the question of her further future on any sheet of paper that any other person living might ever read. On the Friday evening of the 27th of November, Theron sat at his writing table in the South Library at midnight. The single-trimmed lamp stood at his right elbow. The small steady fire had been banked an hour before by Mr. Pollard on his last round. The house was quiet. He had a sheet of plain-folded foolscap before him and his second-best pen in his hand, and he was drafting the words he intended to deliver the following morning at the schoolroom at 11:15. He wrote the proposal 3 times. The first version ran long. It carried his reasons, his gratitude, the small, careful sentences a man of 35 might write to a woman of 26 who had given his daughter back to him out of a silence he had not himself been able to break. He read it through once. He set it aside. It was too long and too careful. And a woman who had stood at the leaded window in the corridor for 8 months with her diary closed in her hand did not need a man's careful reasons set in front of her at 11:15 on a Saturday morning. The second version ran short. It was 4 sentences. He read it through. It was too short. He had cut from it the one thing he meant her to hear, which was that the household intended to keep her, and that he himself was the household. The third version stood plain. It ran to 11 sentences. It named her. It named his daughter. It named the small turning point of the 17th of September. It said what he meant. He read it through twice. He did not alter a word. He did not seal it. He meant to speak the words. He folded the third draft once at the centre and set it within the small leather commonplace book he kept upon the writing table, and he wrote at the top of the page upon which he had set it in his own plain hand, Friday, 27th November, 1818. He closed the commonplace book. He put out the candle. He sat for a long minute in the dim South Library by the small banked firelight, and he thought of the snail in the Cowper poem that had come home to its quiet shell, and of the small clear voice that had said Papa at 4:30 on the 17th of September, and of the woman who had set the book down without exclaiming, and had said only that the papa should come at 5, as he always did. He rose. He went upstairs. Saturday the 28th of November in the year 1818 came in cold and quiet at Highdale Park, with a hoar-frost on the south lawn that did not lift until past 9, and a pale, washed Yorkshire sky behind the bare beeches of the avenue. By 11, the household had settled into its quiet, weekday morning order. Mrs. Lowther was kneading the second batch of plain shortbread on the long deal table in the kitchen, the fire drawing well. Mr. Pollard was in the silver pantry at the third drawer counting forks, Nurse Staley was in the upper linen press folding pinafores, and Mrs. Carmichael, having seen the schoolroom fire properly made up at 10:30, had taken her plain sewing to the small chair just inside the schoolroom door. In the schoolroom itself, at the writing desk by the leaded south window, where the cold winter light came in pale, and even across the worn green baize blotter, Vivian sat with the copybook open and the inkwell freshly filled. Esme stood at her elbow with the steel pen held in the careful, steady grip Vivian had taught her in April, copying out for the 3rd time the morning sentence, "The patient hand will find its quiet work," in the round, even letters of an 8-year-old's careful copybook. Esme had said her 6th word the previous Friday, looking up from the dish of milk pudding at supper. The word had been please. Vivian had not made a thing of it then, and she did not make a thing of it now. At 11:15 by the case clock in the great hall, which struck out 3 small clear notes into the quiet of the schoolroom, the long firm step came up the south corridor and paused at the schoolroom door. Theron did not, this morning, take the small inclined post at the door jamb that he had taken without speaking through 25 schoolroom afternoons of September and October. He stepped 1/2 pace in. Vivian looked up from the copybook. "Miss Wykeham," he said in his quiet, steady voice. I should be very grateful if you could spare me a quarter hour at the South Library. Vivian set the steel pen down on the blotter beside the inkwell, with the small, composed movement of a woman who has been asked, at her writing desk, perhaps 100 small, ordinary questions in her working life. She inclined her head. "Of course, Your Grace." Mrs. Carmichael, in the small chair just inside the door with her sewing, set the sewing down upon the chair seat and stood up. "Lady Esme," she said in her plain, steady housekeeper's voice, "Mrs. Lowther has the shortbread out of the oven. Shall we go and see whether it is cool enough yet to eat one piece?" Esme set down her own pen carefully beside Vivian's on the blotter. She gave Vivian one small, grave look from under her white blonde fringe, a look that did not require interpretation, and put her small hand in Mrs. Carmichael's. The two of them went out of the schoolroom together, and the door was drawn quietly to. Vivian stood. She smoothed the dark serge of her skirt with one steady hand. She followed Theron down the south corridor, past the great hall where the case clock continued its quiet ticking, and into the South Library, where the fire of seasoned beech was burning small and steady upon the marble hearth, and the long polished walnut writing table stood under the south window with its single trimmed lamp unlit in the winter daylight. He did not sit at the writing table. He stood beside it, with one hand resting upon its edge. He gestured her toward the small carved chair set at the table's side. Vivian sat. She folded her hands in her lap. Theron drew a small, composed breath. "Miss Wykeham, I had not, when I rode home from town in August, expected this morning. I had expected to come home to a silent daughter and a fourth governess soon to be dismissed. I came home to a daughter who began to speak in September because of you, and to an hour each weekday at the schoolroom door that I have looked forward to as I have looked forward to no other hour in 3 years and a quarter. I am asking now, plainly, without elegance, that you should consider the proposal of becoming my wife. The decision is wholly yours. You may have whatever time you need to consider it. If your answer is no, you shall continue as my daughter's governess on the same terms, and the proposal shall never be raised again." He stopped. The fire upon the marble hearth ticked once. Somewhere on the south side of the house, very far away, a rook went over. Vivian sat for the long, composed silence of a woman who has trained herself, through 8 months of north wing evenings, not to permit her hands to tremble, nor her breath to catch. She did not look at the worn turkey rug. She did not look at the marble hearth. She looked steadily at the corner of the writing table where his hand rested. The case clock in the great hall struck the 12:15. 3 slow, even notes that travelled down the south corridor and into the library through the closed mahogany door. And still she did not speak. He waited. He did not move his hand from the edge of the table. At last, in the same steady, low schoolroom voice with which she had read aloud the Cowper passage about the snail on the cold, pale blue Thursday afternoon of the 17th of September, she answered him, "Your Grace, I shall." Theron inclined deeply from the waist. He did not, in the South Library at noon on the 28th of November, take her gloved hand to his lips, nor cross the small distance of the worn turkey rug between them. He said only, in the same quiet voice in which he had said, "I have heard you," Esme on the schoolroom rug on the 17th of September, "Miss Wykeham, thank you." She rose. She inclined in return. He opened the South Library door for her. She walked back down the south corridor to the schoolroom, with the same steady step with which she had walked away from it, and he returned to the long, polished walnut writing table and sat down to write 3 private letters. One to Mr. Fairfax in London, one to Lady Maud at Whitaker Hall, and one to the Reverend Newcombe at the parsonage at Highdale by the Beck, that would not be sealed until after 3:30. By 4:30, when Esme came back to the schoolroom from the kitchen with a small crumb of shortbread still upon the corner of her pinafore, the white linen of Vivian's collar had been pressed flatter against the dark surge of her right shoulder, where, in the quarter hour after she had returned alone to the schoolroom, her own hand had pressed it there in one slow movement of steady disbelief. At 4 o'clock, the three of them met in the South Library. Mrs. Carmichael, having brought Esme down from the schoolroom by Theron's quiet word, withdrew at the door. The small, steady fire upon the marble hearth burned at the same patient pace at which it had burned at noon. Esme sat upon the small upholstered footstool beside her father's wing-chair, her white-blonde head at the level of his knee. Vivian stood one composed pace behind the chair, her hand resting upon its carved back. Theron looked down at his daughter. He spoke plainly in the steady level voice in which he had said, "I have heard you. Esme in September." "Esme, I have asked Miss Wickham this morning whether she would consent to become my wife and your stepmother. She has said that she shall, if you are content with the arrangement. I am asking you now, whether you are content. There is no obligation upon you. You may take as long as you wish to consider it." Esme sat very still for the length of a small, considering minute. The fire upon the marble hearth ticked once. She looked up at her father from under the white-blonde fringe, and then she turned her grave, grey-blue eyes upward and back over her own shoulder to the woman standing one pace behind the chair. Then she looked back at her father. "Good," she said. It was her 5th word of the autumn, 3 months and a fortnight after the first word in September. She did not say it twice. She climbed up upon her father's knee, a thing she had not done, by Nurse Staley's later quiet count, in 3 years and 1 month since the autumn before her mother's death, and she laid her white-blonde cheek against the dark superfine of his coat at the shoulder. Then she reached one small hand back, past her father's arm, and took Vivian's hand from where it rested on the carved back of the chair. And she held it there in her own small steady grip, without saying any further word. The three of them remained so for several minutes by the South Library fire, while the case clock in the great hall struck the 4:15 and then the 1/2, and Mr. Pollard, who had paused at the South Library door with a tea-tray, and had heard the single word, "good," withdrew very quietly back along the south corridor, toward the kitchen, and put the tea-tray down upon the dresser without speaking, where Mrs. Carmichael and Mrs. Lowther read the news in his face within the half-minute. Lady Maud and Sir Conrad came up from Whittaker Hall on Monday the 30th of November, the carriage turning up the avenue at 1:45, and the small brown trunk and the 2 carpet-bags carried up by Mr. Pollard's second footman to the south wing guest-rooms before the half-hour was struck. Maud, in the morning-room at the tea-table at 12:30, with Vivian at her right hand and Theron at her left, wept one single steady tear that ran down without embarrassing anyone, and laughed through it in her plain country sister's voice. "I have been telling him this since the 2nd week of October," she said to Vivian, "and I beg you will not consider yourself in any way obliged to me for it. The man has been an absolute fool for 3 years and a quarter, and you are the only person at Highdale who has had the patience to wait for him to remember he has a tongue in his head." Sir Conrad laughed once into his teacup at that, and shook Theron's hand afterwards in the long, firm country handshake of a brother-in-law who has carried a quiet worry for 3¼ years, and has had it lifted. Esme, brought in at the 1:15 with Mrs. Carmichael at her elbow, sat composedly upon Lady Maud's knee for the full half-hour, and said very quietly, when Maud asked her whether she was content, "Yes, aunt." Mr. Fairfax, in London, was written to that evening. His careful approving reply came down by the Tuesday post. On the Sunday following, the 29th of November, The Reverend Newcombe stood at the chancel step at St. Margaret's Parish Church at Highdale by the Beck at the close of the morning service, and read the banns of marriage between Theron Henry Ashwood of this parish and Vivian Bridget Wycombe of this parish for the first time of asking. He read them again on the 6th of December for the second time of asking, and on the 13th of December for the third time of asking, in the same plain, steady country clergyman's voice in which he had baptized, married, and buried the parish for 31 years. The village heard them. The household heard them. On the second Sunday and the third, the parish women came up the south aisle at the close of the service with small posies of late bronze chrysanthemums and dark green ivy, and laid them upon the chancel step without speaking, in the plain country manner of a parish that has watched a duke at his quiet pew for 3¼ years of mourning, and has, at last, seen the black crape lifted. The wedding was at 10 o'clock on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 19th of December at the small 12th century Yorkshire parish church of pale Yorkshire stone, low square Norman tower, plain oak pews polished by 7 centuries, narrow lancet windows admitting the cold pale blue Yorkshire December light. Reverend Newcombe stood at the altar with his plain prayer book open in his hands. Theron stood at the chancel step in black superfine wedding tailcoat with a single sprig of dark bronze chrysanthemum at his lapel. The black crepe mourning band had been taken off his left arm 3 days previous, 3 years and 2 months after the 14th of October, 1815, the proper observance complete. Sir Conrad stood at his right hand as groomsman, in plain country black. Vivian came up the south aisle on Mr. Fairfax's thin scholarly arm. Her wedding gown was a simple high-waisted ivory silk, with short puff sleeves and a single narrow row of small antique seed pearls at the hem, long plain ivory silk gloves, a small coronet of late chrysanthemums and dark green ivy pinned to the smooth, low chignon of her hair, the heirloom ashwood blonde lace wedding veil pinned to the coronet and laid over her shoulders without hiding her face. 5 paces ahead of the bride walked Esme in plain pale blue silk with a small white pinafore, carrying a small posy of late November chrysanthemums tied with pale blue ribbon. Her white blonde head was held very steady, and she did not look back, and she did not falter on the 7 steps of the south aisle, and she set her posy down upon the chancel step at exactly the place Vivian had shown her at the Thursday afternoon rehearsal. Lady Maud, in plain pale cream silk, took the bride's bouquet at the chancel step, and stood at Vivian's left hand as matron of honour. Mr. Pollard, Mrs. Carmichael, Mrs. Lowther, and Nurse Staley sat in the front pew on the household side. The whole village of Highdale by the Beck filled the back pews. The small posies of bronze chrysanthemums and dark green ivy still pinned along the chancel rail from the 3rd Sunday of asking. The vows were spoken in the plain old form. Theron took Vivian to be his wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better for worse, for richer for poorer, in sickness and in health. Vivian took Theron in the same plain words, in the steady low schoolroom voice in which she had said, "Your Grace, I shall." At noon on the 28th of November, the plain gold ashwood band was set upon Vivian's gloved finger. Reverend Newcombe pronounced them man and wife. The small Yorkshire congregation, in the back pews of pale Yorkshire stone, said Amen. The wedding breakfast was at the long mahogany dining table at Highdale Park, set for 11, with Mrs. Lowther's plain English fruit cake under pale Yorkshire icing at the centre. A single sprig of late chrysanthemum laid upon the icing. Maud's elder sister-in-law from the West Riding said the grace in the plain country form. Sir Conrad rose at the head of the table and gave the long composed country toast to the bride, to the groom, to Lady Esme, to the parish, and to the steady patient working of small things in their proper time. that the household quoted afterwards in the servants' hall for many weeks. Mr. Fairfax, in his plain black superfine, gave the brief lawyer's blessing in 3 composed sentences. Mr. Pollard stood at the sideboard throughout the long ceremony of it, white-haired and still, his hands behind his back. When the breakfast was over, Theron and Vivian walked out together along the South Rose Garden gravel, past the bare stems pruned for the winter, to the small iron bench at the south corner where, on the cold, pale blue Sunday afternoon of the 6th of September, after the morning service, Esme had reached with her left hand and taken Vivian's hand for the first time. They stood at the bench in the cold, pale blue Yorkshire December afternoon for the length of one slow, composed minute. They did not speak. Then they turned together and walked back to the house through the south door, and Mr. Pollard, who had been watching from the south corridor window without making any pretense of doing anything else, drew the heavy door quietly to behind them. 1 year and 2 months after the wedding, on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 19th of February in the year 1820, their first child, a son, christened Henry Theron Ashwood, Marquis of Highmore, was baptised at the parish church of St. Margaret's, Highdale by the Beck, in the North Riding of Yorkshire, by the Reverend Newcombe, with Lady Maud Whittaker standing as godmother and Sir Conrad Whittaker as godfather. The infant was 3 weeks and 4 days old. The heirloom Ashwood christening robe of ivory silk and old Mechlin lace, last used at Esme's christening in the spring of '10, came out of the cedarwood chest in the south wing nursery the Friday previous, and was aired in the schoolroom upon the back of a plain elm chair. The family Bible entry was written that evening in the 4th Duke of Highdale's own steady hand, at the South Library writing table, beneath the entry for his late wife, Lady Linnet of the 15th of October, 1815, and was the first hopeful family Bible entry the 4th Duke of Highdale had made in 5½ years. 8 months and a week after the christening, on the cold, pale blue Tuesday evening of the 27th of October in the year 1820, at 8:30 in the South Library at Highdale Park, the single-trimmed lamp upon the long polished walnut writing table, the small steady fire of seasoned beech on the marble hearth, the worn Turkey rug, the 2 faded crimson leather wing chairs drawn close, the 4th Duchess of Highdale, Vivian Ashwood, 28, sat in her usual right-hand wing chair, reading aloud in her steady low voice from a small cloth-bound copy of Persuasion. The 4th Duke of Highdale, Theron, 37, sat in the wing chair opposite, his late father's chair, in steady composed listening, the firelight upon the firm short jaw and the single line at the brow. Lady Esme, now 10½ and speaking in the full sentences of an ordinary, intelligent child of her age, lay asleep on the small sofa drawn up beside her stepmother's chair, with her white blonde cheek pressed against Vivian's shoulder and one small hand resting in Vivian's lap upon the open page. The infant Marcus was asleep upstairs in his nurse's arms in the south wing nursery, beneath the same ivory silk and old Mechlin lace that had warmed his half-sister at her own christening 10½ years before. There are stories that begin with a kiss. There are stories that begin with a vow. There are stories that begin with a knock, and stories that begin with a hired post-chaise, and stories that begin with a Tacitus on a stone bench, and stories that begin with a tortoise-shell cat asleep upon an embroidered cushion, and stories that begin with a brush dragging on a cold flagstone, and stories that begin with a letter from Quatre Bras read aloud in a Bath upper room, and stories that begin with a young widow standing at the foot of her late husband's stair, and stories that begin with a young woman stepping down from a mail coach with a single carpet bag, and stories that begin with a public notice in the Morning Chronicle. And there are, slowest and most patient of all, of the smallest hand on the largest grief, stories that begin with 3 short entries in a governess's leather pocket diary, dated Tuesday the 10th of March, Thursday the 9th of April, and Wednesday the 5th of August in the year 1818, kept on the dressing table of a north wing bedchamber at a Yorkshire country house, and a child of 8 years old, who had not spoken since her mother's death of 3 years past, sitting at a schoolroom writing desk on the cold, pale blue Thursday afternoon of the 17th of September, hearing read aloud the small Cowper passage about the snail coming home to its quiet shell at evening, and saying in a small, clear voice that had not been heard at Highdale Park in 3 years and 4 months, "Papa." And so, on the cold, pale blue Saturday morning of the 19th of December, in the year of our Lord 1818, in the small Yorkshire parish church of St. Margaret at Highdale by the Beck, under the cold blue North Riding winter sun, Miss Vivian Wykeham, who had come down by post-chaise from York on the cold pale blue afternoon of the 10th of March in the same year with a single carpet-bag and a small leather pocket diary, and had spent the 8 months following teaching by the steady patient method an 8-year-old child, who had not spoken in 3 years, became, by the patient, steady listening of the Duke who had stood 25 weekday afternoons at her schoolroom door without speaking, and the small turning point of a Cowper poem about a snail, and a quiet shell at 4:30 on a September Thursday, the 4th Duchess of Highdale and the woman who had given his daughter back her voice.